and expectations and all of that. We are shortening these because we know everyone's incredibly busy. So my guess is that today we're going to go somewhere between 20 and 30-ish minutes, and then there'll be some time for questions and just see what else resonates. In terms of introductions, I'm going to go pretty quickly. I think a lot of people are getting to know me, and I'm getting to know names. My name's Jenny Scala, and I work with the College and Career Readiness and Success Center. And then I see just two other people that have joined us. So Kirsten and Shelley, I don't know if you want to do quick introductions yourselves.
Hi, this is Shelley Andrews, and I am with the Department of Education, specifically work with District Assessment System and a statewide system of support.
Great, thanks.
Hi, it's Kirsten. I'm also with the department with our Division of Individual Learning.
Great, thanks. And Bart, has anyone joined you in the room with you?
Not today. Nope, it's just me.
Okay. All right, we'll keep going. So there are two other items on the agenda for today's session, database decision-making and doing an overview of that. And then in my mind, where a lot of the database decision-making kind of, where people really grapple with it and see examples of it, end up being oftentimes in selecting appropriate interventions and strategies. So I have that in there. My assumption is that today we're only really going to get into database decision-making, and I'm going to get more into the selecting appropriate interventions in February session. But knowing that they're connected, I wanted to do all of the slides together, and we'll see how far we get today. If we don't get to it today, then we'll have it for the next session in February. So from my perspective, database decision-making is really the heart of a multi-tiered system of support. And database decision-making connects to each of the other core components of MTSS. In the previous sessions, we've talked about those. So there are aspects of database decision-making that go into screening, so identifying students who are at risk, progress monitoring, and then providing various interventions and supports at a scaffold level for students. So this is why I consider database decision-making the heart of MTSS. It is also, not too surprisingly, since it's the heart of it, in my opinion, it's also one of the hardest portions of it. So today what I'm going to be doing is take some of the theoretical, how people talk about this database decision-making. I feel like it's become kind of a really common phrase. We're going to use this data to make decisions, instructional changes, and so kind of taking it from more of that, it's not really theoretical, but really providing some practical application and examples of how we've seen database decision-making happen and occur in middle and high schools. And then the last slide that I have in this section is actually a kind of guidebook that I've created. It's not a guidebook, but it's a way of almost kind of breaking down database decision-making into more tangible pieces, because I think most educators understand the notion of database decision-making and they all buy into it, but it's the how to take all of these various data sources and make sense of it that is a challenge. And that's what my final slide of today's session will cover. So going back to the research, in 2009, the Institute of Education Sciences, IES, actually released a practice guide that is one of my favorites, and it's on using student achievement data. And they have 5 recommended practices that are outlined in the practice guide. And as you look through these, none of these are really all that surprising, which I think is, again, can be really helpful. It also means that none of these are those kind of silver bullets either. But the first recommendation is this notion of making data part of an ongoing process or instructional improvement cycle. So it's ongoing. And so this really connects to some of what we've talked to previously about a culture of using data. You're going to be more likely to use data in terms of your decision-making the more common that you have discussions about data. Not that surprising when you think about it, but it means that we need to establish that culture of using data, and it's that idea of with more practice, we get more comfortable with it. As we become more comfortable with it, we're going to use it and do it more often. So that's that first recommendation. The second one, one of the great things about working with secondary students is I think it's really easy to get them involved in not only creating their own learning goals, but monitoring progress towards those goals. I've seen that in a lot of different ways. There's been some schools that I've been in where students have individual folders, and they make their own bar graphs or other graphs or pie charts. And so just different ways of having students be responsible for monitoring their progress. And then that gives them some, as well as having them get involved in establishing kind of long, medium, and short-term goals, and then having them kind of understand what it means to reach those goals and work towards those goals. And so that's one of the things that I really find beneficial about working with secondary students is being able to get them involved and really owning their learning process a little bit as well. The third is this idea of establishing clear vision for school-wide data use. I'm going to talk about using data at all levels in the school and district, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the implications at the state level as well. So we want to make sure that there is that kind of understanding of the vision for using data and what that ends up meaning and why it's important, and sharing that and really walking the talk of that. So the fourth one is providing supports that foster data-driven culture within the school. When I think about this, it also means that we have to give adults the time to really review and analyze their data. This idea of becoming a data culture school and using data wisely doesn't happen unless people have time to really dig in, analyze, synthesize, reflect, and make action plans. So that requires some potential structural changes in terms of how adults are using their own meeting time and things of that nature. And the fifth recommendation from this practice guide is develop and maintain a district-wide data system. In most, I would say most local education agencies have some sort of district-wide system for data, and obviously this is particularly helpful in areas where students might be moving around a lot, transferring in and out of different schools. There's some areas that we definitely know where student population moves with rent increases as well. So anything that can help make sure that as students transfer between schools, and that also means for transitioning from middle into high school so that teachers can get previous history on students, can be really helpful in terms of making decisions. So those are the 5 practice guide recommendations. And then I want to give even more specific examples of what these recommendations can look like in practice. And I gave some with each of them on the previous slide, but I wanted to be much more concrete in terms of these examples. So this idea of analyzing data at all levels, so oftentimes when we talk about this in a multi-tiered system of support setting, people think about Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, which is true. You do want to analyze your data at all levels, not just Tier 2, Tier 3 interventions, but additionally that Tier 1, how is the Tier 1 doing in terms of supporting all of our students? But it's also just as true that you want to analyze data at the school, district, and state level. So from a district perspective, you might be able to see which interventions and supports are better supporting your students district-wide when you're looking across the district in terms of what your data are telling you. And there are other aspects in terms of state supports that you can use as well. And I know a lot of states are kind of using this as well in terms of really walking the talk and really trying to target different supports, knowing that oftentimes neither states nor districts are going to be able to mandate what interventions are being used, but they can start to point out and share what they're seeing across trends and groups of schools and not give out data in a way that's identifying students, but again, those trends can be really helpful. Another aspect that is particularly helpful is establishing routines and procedures. So I also say that it's important for these to ideally be written down because we know, again, in education that we have a lot of transitions with adults, and also the fact of writing something down means that when we walk out of our meeting and we go on and do other things and then circle back to this a few days later when it feels like it's been a few years later just because of all of the demands that we have on our daily schedule, it's helpful to have these routines and procedures written down so that we can go back and reference them so that we're not relying solely on our memory. It also ends up helping in terms of increasing the fidelity of the database decision-making process. Also means that it's more likely that students who need resources, that there is an increased chance of equity across students in terms of receiving these resources among students, classes, and schools. And then it can also be a way to help train new teachers moving forward as well. And so as we have these routines written down, that just helps that much more. So another example of this would be having data teams meet regularly at school at scheduled intervals, such as monthly or bi-monthly, and just having that kind of, this is how we operate, and having that written down. The third aspect on the slide, setting explicit decision rules. We often hear of schools having agreed upon decisions for at what point a student needs additional supports or interventions, but we don't always hear as much about the explicit decision rules for when a student no longer needs the support and services. And the difference there is once you get to the point of being able to indicate what the exit criteria are, that allows, again, that consistency. And without it, it could be that students end up in these interventions for the whole semester or the whole year, which doesn't allow students to get back on track. And so it's really important to have those decision rules for determining student progress. You also want to have rules about goal-setting procedures, referring students to different programs, and things of that nature. And then data is also used to compare and contrast the adequacy of the core curriculum. So this is getting at this notion of, is Tier 1 working? And then the effectiveness of other intervention supports and strategies that might be used. And those strategies could be used in Tier 1. Again, a Tier 1 support can be a strategy that's provided for all students. It's not necessarily associated with an explicit curriculum or packaged intervention or curriculum, but really looking at the effectiveness of what's happening for all students. So these are additional examples of the IES Practice Guide recommendation. So I know we've talked about the triangle before, and here's another just example of it. So we have this triangle, and this is a triangle of tiered interventions, and we've got the green, which is about the approximate 80% of your students should be served strongly based off of your Tier 1, which is the school-wide instruction for all students, and that includes differentiated instruction. And on the bottom of the triangle, you're going to see academic focuses on the left and behavior focuses on the right. And you'll recall in previous sessions we've talked about how one of the great things about secondary schools as they're implementing multi-tiered systems of support is that they need to use their own data to determine their focus. So what's the focus going to be? What are their data suggesting that their focus be? So for ease, I put academic and behavior up on the slide. It could be that you're focused on some other aspect. Maybe you're focused on attendance. That's okay. I just didn't want people to only think about this as solely being academic or solely being behavior. So in this tiered approach, you want to make sure that you're using data to determine at what point students receive supports. You'll see in the middle of the triangle is a kind of bluish triangle that cuts through the green, yellow, and red sections, with a pull-out arrow being students that have disabilities that are receiving services. So this idea is that students with disabilities are not only served in Tier 3, they're not only served in Tier 2, they can be served wherever their needs are, and their needs can be different depending on your focus. There are many instances where students with disabilities may need additional support in reading, but not in math when you're thinking about it on the academic side, or maybe it's the inverse. And so this notion that students with disabilities can be served at any of those three levels, it's the same if you have an English language learning population. They're not just all grouped in one cluster and in one tier. It's through all of the ranges and the levels and the multi-tiers. And so it's really being intentional about making sure that students receive the supports that they need regardless of any demographic information or characteristics and things like that. And so that's really one of the things that we like to remind people about as we're thinking about data. Okay, so database decision making. What does it actually mean, and what are some of the types of decisions that can be made? So when we think about instruction, that's often talking about how effective is the instruction and what instructional changes need to be made. That also means another group or common type of decisions is around evaluating effectiveness. So this can be whether or not the core curriculum is effective for most students. Again, going back to that previous slide, we want it to be effective for about 80% of our population. And then looking more specifically at interventions, is one intervention more effective than another intervention? And then the idea of moving within a multi-tiered system of supports. So how do we know when a student no longer needs additional supports? Or how do we know when a student needs additional supports? So these are examples of some of the decisions that should be outlined and put down in writing by your teams. So I want to pause here just for a moment and see if anybody has any of these types of decisions written down within your school or district. And if so, if they are willing to share.
Jenny, we have decision rules more for the elementary schools who are implementing MTSS. The secondary, we're still in the exploring stage, and so we haven't defined those decision rules yet.
So what are some of those, and I think you're probably very, very, that's very typical. So what are some of, when you're thinking about those decision rules at the elementary school, what are some of them that exist within the district?
So for example, we really focus on 2 data points. So our state assessment pause data and then the NWEA MAPS data. So for example, to be considered in need of Tier 2 supports, the pause score has to be basic. And then the NWEA MAP score has to be anything between the 15th percentile and the 39th percentile. So we have it defined that way. And then teachers are able to bring in anecdotal information as well, so their opinion about how the student's doing, and maybe even also grades. So, and then we have a decision rule for Tier 3 as well.
Perfect. How about in terms of, so do you have decision rules around that final big bullet in terms of the movement between supports and interventions? So it sounds like you've got the entry. Do you have either movement or exit criteria established?
You know, at this point, it's just once they reach the criteria for the next tier, essentially, then they're moved.
Got it. So you have more of the kind of the increased support, but not for the exiting support.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
And that's pretty common. And I would say as your schools, your secondary schools are embarking on kind of trying to figure out what MTSS means to them, it's really easy to think about those entrance criteria. I think that one, everyone's like, yeah, I get it. We need to make sure if we have multiple classes for algebra that if I'm identified in one teacher's classroom, that I would also be identified in another teacher's classroom so that all the students that need the support are getting the support. I think people really understand that. I think it's the idea of then being clear about those exit criteria is really, really important, because otherwise, in some ways, we've reestablished grouping and tracking, because it's not as if when I get an additional intervention and support, I automatically have an additional class put into my schedule, right? So we're moving me within my existing schedule, which generally means that I might be losing an elective. And so, wanting to make sure that students get back on track, and so that that movement out and that exit criteria is delineated. And I also think that that helps kind of put a frame of reference back of we're not just moving students into these as a kind of permanent placement, and that's particularly important when you think about Tier 2. Tier 2 should be something that's a short-term kind of time frame. It's not something that should be throughout the entire year. Now, if a student needs it for a lot of different reasons, that's different. But if I need help, which I do, on proportions and ratio, it doesn't mean that I should lose my elective for the entire year if really the support that I need is just on proportions and ratios. So I think taking the time to have the conversations about what exit criteria could be can be helpful, because I think it also helps frame the notion of students are going to have a more fluid experience based off of the supports that they need, and setting up those criteria for entrance and exit early on also helps support that, which gets back to one of the goals in the IES practice guide is that vision for using data. And I think that can be helpful. And then this other kind of notion of evaluating the core curriculum or looking at your Tier 1. Does anyone have an example of looking at their core curriculum, their Tier 1, to determine if it is effective for most students?
I can share again, Jenny.
Sure, thanks.
We're, again, in the elementary schools, we're using our benchmark data along with our pause data to evaluate curriculum. And based on that information, we've really taken a look and adopted a new math curriculum, and are in the process of looking at a new reading curriculum. So, and we have that standard as well, essentially meeting the needs of most students with the goal of 80%.
Perfect. That's fantastic. And there have been times when I'm working with schools and really getting them kind of starting to think about their multi-tiered system of support and trying to kind of map out in their own mind and make some predictions about kind of that Tier 1, how many students, the rough percentage of students are being effectively met with their Tier 1 is a great way for people to start to think about, well, do we have an inverted pyramid? Is the pyramid in the right way that approximately 80% of our students are being met with this core curriculum, our Tier 1? And so that's another way to kind of help people think about it in terms of thinking about the core curriculum and whether or not Tier 1, as it is in place right now, is really that strong Tier 1 supports that are meeting the needs of the majority of the students in the school. So I wanted to give some examples from middle schools across the country and some of the examples of how they're using data. And I have 2 slides for middle schools, and then I believe it's 2 slides for high schools as well. And so these, again, are examples from multiple middle schools across the country. So in one of the middle schools that we talked to a couple of years ago, or a while ago, they actually had a pre-screening questionnaire that were given to all incoming 6th graders, and that was done by some of the leadership in the middle school going down to elementary school. It varied in terms of when it was given based off of the different schools. We seen lots of different examples. But that pre-screening asked for a brief report from the feeder elementary school on how each student was doing in reading and math. And it was something that was really quick. And so it was also like if the student is kind of on grade level, how are they doing? And then if it was hey, this student might need additional support, then there was additional information on a different page. So it was a very quick kind of at a glance for the incoming sixth graders, but there are some asterisks. These are the students that we need to follow up with. And then that information was then how the middle school started to group students in terms of making sure that students that might need additional support, that they knew from the get-go that the schedule could allow it, or that they were placed in different classes where they could get that additional support. So it was this kind of screening questionnaire that was given as part of the entry and transition into their middle school. In a different middle school, the district had actually said, kind of using state-level assessment data, here were the cut scores, and so any student that was below this threshold was going to get placed in interventions and monitored, and maybe they were just having a bad day when that assessment was given, but we're going to automatically place them in interventions, and then they can move out if those are no longer necessary. But so that was a rule that the district provided, and saying, look, we're going to look across the district, and this is the point in which we want students to be placed into additional interventions. In multiple schools, in middle schools, it was really common for school counselors to be responsible for organizing the data and to be kind of like the data guru in terms of just that organization of the data, making sure that they got the feeder elementary school data coming into them, and then making sure that data were available and letting teachers know when new data were available. There were a lot of different examples of this final bullet in terms of leadership teams and having leadership teams meet on a regular basis to discuss certain students, whether they were students that were receiving interventions, students that had been referred by a student-teacher assistance team, a STAT team, a SPOT team, whatever type of team you want to call it, but that kind of referral process. And this is not referral for special education. This was referral for, hey, we think this student might be in need of additional support. And so those teams take and make, the composition of those varies widely across the nation, as well as the frequency of the meeting time. This example, the leadership team was meeting every 4 weeks. I've been in a lot of other middle schools where the leadership team is actually meeting more frequently than that, but approximately every other week is when they're kind of doing the notion of monitoring student progress. So not just saying which students need additional resources and supports, but how are students that have been placed in these doing? And so figuring out the right frequency for those meetings is important, as well as making sure that you have the right people in those meetings along with the right data that are necessary to be there for it. So this school, the leadership team was meeting every 4 weeks. And then in another school, they had intervention teachers that were meeting every 2 weeks with the kind of grade level or primary level teachers to do the progress monitoring. So figuring out how those conversations are going to work and who's going to be in them. And a lot of smaller schools, it was the same people. And so just getting into the habit of making sure that the adults had the time to talk about students, not just the students that they were worried about needing additional support, but then going back to that progress monitoring. And that's another aspect of making sure that you have some clear decisions on of how are we going to monitor student progress once they've been assigned to these interventions. Are we waiting for quarterly grades? Are there some shorter-term benchmarks that we can use to make sure that we know whether or not students are off track or on track or getting back on track? And then there was another school where they were very, very clear that they looked at their data as a report card for instruction. So not a report card for students, but much more of so how are we doing school-wide in terms of making sure that students are learning what we are teaching. And so kind of flipping it a little bit in that regard. So while those are still some kind of not specific case studies of a exact school, middle school, those are 6 different examples of how different middle schools are using data to make some decisions. So then we're going to move into the high school. So this idea of having a student information system that already has screens or modules or whatever it is for the screening and progress monitoring data. And that could be early warning indicators. It could be that is using state assessment data. That could be a lot of different things. But in this specific example, the school was really, really happy that their student information system had this additional data, the screening and progress monitoring data, right there in the same place, because that really helped with the data consolidation and not having to go to 5 different data warehouse systems to get the data when they were starting their conversations or having their conversations about students. Other schools are using an early warning system tool that is a screener, as we talked about in our previous conversations. When data are reviewed varies, not surprisingly, widely, and as many different schools, there are many different ways of how data are reviewed. Most frequently we hear about professional learning communities, department meetings, if the school has a smaller learning community, whether it's like a 9th grade academy or something like that. Other schools have just monthly data meetings. And they use this time very explicitly to determine which students need additional supports and interventions and student progress monitoring and reviewing that. And both of those are important, and that's what they were doing during these times. Another school that I was at had very explicit exit and entrance criteria. Another school that I was at had a kind of homework center where it was actually staffed throughout the day with an ELA and math teacher, and then for many additional periods they had a science teacher assigned to it, and it was part of teachers' assignments for duties. And during those during the school day and after school, the homework center was opened for some students that wanted to drop in at any period and get additional support. And then there was a system for tracking which students dropped in and the area of support that they asked for. And then for certain students, they were assigned to go to the center for 3 weeks. I always pick on myself with proportions and ratios. And so for me, I would have been assigned it for probably 3 weeks during the proportions and ratios section when we were covering it. And then there would be communication between the math teacher that was at the homework center when I would go, as well as back to my math teacher in terms of assignment, just to see how I was doing and monitoring my progress to see if I needed additional support. So there are a lot of different ways that you can kind of have those exit and entrance criteria, and then also figuring out how to provide those supports, but they're important. These are additional examples. It says Scala because that's my last name, and some people were really explicit in wanting to know which high school it was, so I just named it after myself. In other schools, high schools, there were data days. So the leadership team throughout the year had broken up some of their professional development days into half days and designated them data days, scheduled when they knew that they were going to get like map data results back. And so it was within a week and a half of getting those results back, after there had been some initial analysis done and clustering it out so that leadership had some idea of themes that they presented to all staff. And then teachers were given their data, and then they did really deeper dives into their data to figure out kind of, okay, here's, was this what we were expecting? What is this telling us? What decisions do we need to make? Then there were a lot of students in various high schools that I talked a little bit briefly about of getting the students involved in their progress monitoring data and goals. And I've seen this I mentioned the folders earlier today. I've also seen it where students had their own chart or kind of thermometer or whatever that they were using in terms of just monitoring their progress. And I've seen it even taken an additional step further in some schools where then students ran their own conferences with their parents. So rather than having parent-teacher conferences that were driven just by the teacher to talk with parents about the students were actually part of the conversation, and the students would talk about their goals and their progress to the goals, and then if the teacher wanted to add anything, they could, but it was really driven by the student, and teachers actually practiced with the students talking about their goal, the progress, what the progress meant in terms of some of the activities that they had been doing in the classroom. So there's a lot of ways of really getting students involved in their own progress monitoring for not only the additional interventions and supports, but are students on track in terms of learning what we're hoping that they're going to learn in this quarter, in this semester, in this year. For high school students, are students on track in terms of credits? Oftentimes, the credits required for high school graduation may or may not match the entry criteria at the land-grant institutions in the state. So kind of having some of those conversations as well. And so you can have discussions on goals and monitoring at different grain size, how I'm doing in a specific class, what those goals are, how am I doing in terms of the overall school, graduation goals, things like that. So there's lots of different ways that you can get students involved as well. And I think that's really, really important and helps with the engagement. It helps with the personalization. It's really, really helpful. And then in many of the schools that I have talked to, there was this idea of figuring out at what point do we notify parents about students' participation in Tier 2, Tier 3 levels of support, and kind of making that decision. With this particular example, it was within 2 weeks of placement of Tier 2 or Tier 3 supports is when parents were notified. There have been other schools that I've been to that they have made decisions that it's really based off of what changes in the schedule. So if there's a schedule change and a student is no longer receiving an elective and they're getting assigned to an intervention, that parent notification happens much faster than 2 weeks, more within a week of that happening, if not sooner. And then there's other areas in schools where they've decided that they don't necessarily, 2 weeks is sufficient. So that's, again, another kind of decision point that you'll have to make. So this idea of, okay, we've talked about data, we've talked about different types of decisions that are made using data in terms of instruction, in terms of changing interventions, in terms of progress monitoring. Well, how do we go about doing that? And so what's going to come up on this slide as I start the animation is that there's basically going to be two columns. On the left column are these kind of bigger buckets of a way of breaking down the data-based decision-making process, and then the information that's going to be on the right are some follow-up questions that can help you get to what's on the left. So the big picture, you want to have a big picture of what your data are telling you. And so that's often going to be things like reviewing your data, taking a few steps back, not digging into the weeds, but really saying, okay, are there patterns? Are we going to make any predictions about our data before we dig into it? Going back to that triangle, if I was to ask you to make some predictions about how many students were sufficiently supported in Tier 1, as you're getting your MAP data back, how many students do you think are going to be at different levels? So just starting to help people make some of those predictions can also help ground them in the conversation that you're having in that moment. So two big areas, reviewing your big picture data, making predictions, and then starting to say, okay, as I'm just doing a very cursory level, what patterns emerge. So then we've looked at our big picture, and then we're going to say, all right, so what is our target? What do we want to focus in on a little bit more? And within this, you're going to want to figure out what students or groups of students are we most concerned with? And then what initial theories may explain why this student or groups of students are at risk. So saying, okay, we've gone from the big picture, we're defining our target, we might have some initial theories that may explain it. And having these initial theories can help us figure out then what other data we might need. So are there additional information that you could collect that will help you better understand what's going on? And what's up on the screen is also talking about those underlying causes of risk. And so previously when we talked about screening, screeners identify students who are at risk, but those are just symptoms. Those are not the underlying cause. So ultimately you have to get at the underlying causes of risk, and there's usually multiple, it's not usually one, but kind of saying what's really going on with students. And it's also saying, okay, based off of our initial theories, are there gaps in the data that you have available? If you're looking at your student information system, is that giving you the right grain size? Do you need to go get additional progress monitoring data from some other source? So let's go get our other data. We've identified it, and then from there, we can start to say, okay, here is where we're confirming the underlying causes that we want to figure out. So we've gone and gotten our other data. So what are we learning from this additional data? What do you now believe is the likely cause of risk? So doing root cause analysis, the why, because, why process, or doing the fishbone. There's lots of different ways that you can do kind of root cause analysis, but this is really important to make sure that you've determined the cause. And then what do students or groups of students need to resolve the problem that we've now identified? And then from there, we do action planning. And that gets to the what steps or tasks need to be implemented to address the underlying cause of concern, determining how these changes are going to be monitored and determine your student progress, and then thinking about how fidelity will be monitored, because we want to make sure that we monitor fidelity. So this is one kind of process that we've worked through in various schools to help kind of take the notion of database decision-making and making it a little bit more tangible. So I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions that anyone has. I'm not hearing any questions, and we've gone for about 45 minutes, and so I just wanted to kind of wrap it up here, and then we can talk about the selecting appropriate interventions next month, or I can talk with Bart and figure out if it makes more sense to go back and talk about some of the Tier 1 aspects and making sure that there's a strong Tier 1 system in place. Giving it time to see if there are any additional questions. It doesn't look like anyone's put any questions into the chat box.
Jenny, I have a question for you.
Great, thanks.
So when you're talking about using data to evaluate core curriculum at the secondary level, what does that look like? In other words, what are people using as the outcome data that they're using to evaluate curriculum? I mean, is it ACT scores? Is it state assessment scores? Is it grades? What do you see?
I think it's a lot of different things, but it generally, if it is a subject area where there is a state assessment topic that aligns to it, it's often that the state assessment data provides kind of a, okay, we're on target or we're not on target. So I think that often gets to the, is what we're doing sufficient meeting our Tier 1? And if not, what's going on? So state assessments are one thing. If there are district benchmarks, those are another that can be used. Many secondary schools are using NWEA MAP, at least in the middle schools, they're using that. A lot of high schools are using different benchmark measures, and that's what they're doing. So that tends to be more at the school level, and I'm thinking more in the mid and large high schools for that. For smaller high schools, it often goes back to the state assessment just in terms of if there is a single class for English language arts for ninth grade, that's generally measured by the state assessment most of the time. Grades, I would say grades in and of themselves, unless there has been work done about really doing standards-based grading, it becomes really challenging for grades to be the way of evaluating whether or not students are on target. Because within multiple teachers, the wanting to make sure that an A is an A is an A, unless there's been some agreement about that in a way that everyone agrees, we found that grades, it can be done, and there are places where it is being done, but generally it's not done as much. It's not as common, I guess would be how I would phrase that. Does that help?
Yeah, it does, absolutely. And then as far as progress monitoring goes, are those grades that you use for in that case?
So this will depend on if you're talking about if a student is receiving kind of Tier 2 support, if you're talking about students being progress monitored once they're receiving Tier 2 supports, that will depend on how students are getting assigned to those Tier 2 supports. So going back to my proportions, that could be that the teacher that I'm going to the homework center or I'm assigned the homework center is working through a number of different types of kind of worksheets, knowing the standards that proportions and ratios are hitting and how those standards are going to be tested, and so kind of doing the mastery measurement for proportions and ratios. We don't have as much in the high school, the kind of general outcome measure, the way that we do in some of the elementary schools. We have for some content, but not nearly as much as we do in elementary schools. Elementary schools have more of those kind of, are students on target? Think about MAP. MAP can give you that. And we don't have as many options for that in the high school setting, and that's where oftentimes progress monitoring becomes the grades, and that's where it becomes important for communication between the intervention teacher and the main content teacher if you're talking about academic support. If you're talking about attendance, that's going to be kind of the frequency of tardies or absences. If it's an absence for a particular period during the day, coming up with some sort of a buddy system or something like that. So there are ways that you can monitor progress for focus areas that are not just academics. And I think that's important as you're picking your focus and as you're kind of saying, this is what our data are telling us that we need to work on, that you're clear from the get-go of here are the additional supports or types of supports we want to provide, and here's how we're going to monitor student progress. I have been to many a high school that have started the conversation and they have their focus, but they have no idea how to monitor students' progress. But they're really excited about the different tiered supports that they have. But students are in them year after year after year, and then students are getting further and further behind, or they are getting removed from the class that is engaging, that brings them to school, and so they don't find high school at all to be relevant or engaging, and then they drop out.
Okay. And then one last question about the entrance and the exit criteria for the different tiers. Do you recommend in the initial stages of implementation that those criteria are set but then there's a process for reviewing the criteria.
Absolutely. That's absolutely what I recommend. Get in the process of doing it and then know that it's not going to be perfect, but that you've started with something that you can go back and refine and say, this didn't work, but we're going to change it this way. I found that starting with that helps with the notion, as I said, of getting students to exit the intervention, because that intent is written down and everybody sees it. And people want that, but I think when you don't see it, you don't think about it as much because we're all really busy. You can always refine it, but I think it's absolutely critical to start with it. It might not be right, but start with it. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yep. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
No problem. And if there are other questions that you have in between sessions, let me know. And then, Bart, let me know what you're thinking for the next one as well.
Okay, will do. Have a great day.
Thanks, you too.
Bye.
Bye.
Got a parent meeting and a concert.
Well, get out of here.